and a grant in Krieger called Not Just Fun and Games, an empirical perspective on signaling and the intangible legacy of the Olympics from the International Olympic Committee. Yes, the one you're thinking of. And a lot of this comes from the fact that we have a tension, right? Not attention. I know that NLP people are hearing attention, but no, a tension between the disciplines as we try to talk to each other. I think that this Calvin and Hobbes comic is especially prescient now in the age of this fire hose of new computational models that we have to keep up with. What is our role? What is the role of computation in social science? How do we either serve or collaborate with social scientists who have theories that they are trying to develop, investigate, and so on? And the other side of this, more of what we love as computer scientists, I know I'm biased, is from XKCD, this idea of what is easy and what is hard in computer science. So sure, we can do lookup based on GPS, but then figuring out is this a bird is much harder. Figuring out some of the subtle things in text is much harder. So understanding the limitations of what we can do to aid social science. So the project largely had two components that I'll talk about today, along with others that will be for another time. One of them has been the Roundtable series, which we will hear the season finale of today. We brought together faculty, postdocs, PhD students from across the US, starting in September at the APSA annual meeting, that's the American Political Science Association. And we had brilliant, fun people like Justin Gross, Noah Smith, Amber Boyston, and we worked our way, sort of counterclockwise around the country, starting in this place and that, hearing what people had to say about the direction of the field, and whether it even can be considered a field, or is it two separate fields, where things are going. I think that what was especially interesting is just between the UMich and Berkeley roundtables, we had this pivot in computation. ChatGPT hit in the middle of NeurIPS, and the discussion changed completely. It was even more dramatic than what BERT did to NLP. So hearing postdocs and PhD students at Berkeley who are in the thick of it in social sciences, in computer science, saying what's new, how does this affect us, was really helpful to hear. And today we have just this great crew that's going to nicely round out the discussions. And the other side of what we did was case studies investigating different aspects of this, working through a framework for collaboration between computational and social science. The first of the two focused on changes in Hong Kong's freedom of press. We used what at the time we thought were this combination of vintage and vogue techniques, some nowadays maybe a bit more dated things like BERT, who remembers BERT, along with qualitative content analysis, looking at both the rhetorical and the non-rhetorical aspects of Western and Hong Kong-based print newspapers over a 22-year timeline. People are really well familiar in this room, because this is CLSP, with the 2019-2020 Hong Kong protests, because EMLP took place during then in the thick of it. But Hong Kong has a long history of protests that goes back to the colonial era. And so tracking the trends there, we could see things like an agenda of negativity from the Hong Kong press. There's various reasons for that we looked into. There's co-optation of the press. There's strategic rituals to not potentially offend Beijing, right? But what was interesting is that it's not just different, but there are similarities as well in the framing strategies that Western papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post use compared to Hong Kong-based papers like the Hong Kong edition of the South China Morning Post, of the China Daily, and the South China Morning Post. So we had the same framing strategies, but different attitudes. Some of the techniques that we covered, as well as the findings, will be featured in a book, which we are publishing, a free press if you can keep it, which comes out at the end of May. talks about some of the things that we did, it talks about some of the things that we found. The other side of this was signaling and the intangible legacy of the Olympics. So using some text analysis techniques along with some theory drawn from international relations, social science, we found evidence that China failed to convert a soft power accrued through hosting the Olympics into international political primacy. You know, nations have used the Olympic Games for signaling for decades. I think that the notable example was 1936 in Berlin, flaunting the fact that Germany had put together what they wanted to convey as an ordered, effective society. But you had examples of this all throughout the history of the Games. And what we found is that both in 2008 and 2022, Beijing wasn't effectively able to capitalize on this as well as they'd like. Other things about this were that you have different attitudes in the West and in China towards China's attempt at emergence as a global power, and this is reflected in both what is covered and when it is covered. Chinese press becomes more assertive over this timeline, and this is pretty well aligned with this expectation that we have from Beijing policy on both border diplomacy, trying to push an agenda that China is successful regardless of how they are received. So we have the roundtables and we have the case studies. These are the two core pillars of what we've done in the Cassandra Project so far. We presented at NLP venues, at some political science conferences. We were at an ICML workshop, and we do, of course, have the book coming out. But this is all trying to further the same goal that I've been talking about all along, which is trying to increase this collaboration and communication between computational and social science, trying to find common theory, common frameworks for working together. So with that in mind, this is the finale of this season of our roundtable series. We have 4 wonderful speakers who will join me in a second in the front. Please thank them for being here.
Themselves, so better. Let the audience know as much or as little as you like of what you do and your connection with
So my name is Ernesto, Calvo. I direct the interdisciplinary lab for computational social science at Government and Politics, the University of Maryland. I've been working on comparative politics for most of the last 20-something years, and it used to be more computationally intensive before, and now is CSS as the field has migrated very dramatically. So I'm very interested in substantive politics, so everything that has to do with CSS for me is put to the service of understanding politics. So I have, I think, a bit of a different perspective from some colleagues in fields that are more technically oriented.
My name is Şirin. I'm a postdoc here at the Center for Digital Humanities. I have a background both in social sciences and humanities. I did my BA and MA in social sciences, and then I did my PhD here at Hopkins in intellectual history and comparative literature. I care a lot about thinking through disciplinary methodologies, sort of comparative methodologies, and how machine learning tools can be used for literary and cultural domains.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Antonis, Anastasopoulos. I'm probably the most boring of your speakers today. I'm a CS assistant professor in computer science at George Mason University, and I work in natural language processing. My focus largely is building NLP for low resource, endangered languages, in general underserved communities. And I think why I'm here is because I'm also involved with a couple of projects that could be classified as computational social science regarding AI policy or working with communities, for example, in Canada, towards the revitalization of their languages. So, yeah.
We can have a contest to see who's more boring.
Okay, fair enough.
I'll try my hardest. I'm Jeff Gill. I'm a professor of statistics at American University. I also direct.
That is more boring.
See, I already won. Well, I'll get him back. I direct our Center for Data Science. As a statistician, I like to say I study humans. That is, I study them socially, politically, and biomedically. I'm working on everything from synthetic blood to detecting latent anti-Semitism online.
That's a range.
It is. Statisticians get to be eclectic. Well, that's it, I'm done.
So thank you all four for being here. Why don't we delve right into it? It's a question that sort of has had its character really change in the past year even, but how have the past 15 years of interaction between NLP, machine learning, and the social sciences led to new directions and better work in both fields, especially in areas like ethics, data quality, or methodology?
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
You know, when I saw your question, I was thinking, I don't want to talk about the last 15 years, I want to talk about the last 9,000. So about 9,000 years ago was the agricultural revolution, we all know that, where humans decided in most part that they wanted to live in communities together and share more hardship. But we've always been in the big data era. And so people ask me all the time, what is big data? Well, they were in a big data era too. So 5,000 years ago, roughly, the abacus was invented because there was big data that they struggled with. And we just went from different types of machines to different types of machines. So humans are always in this era, even though we're calling this the big data era. And in fact, the interesting part about that is that we're in the middle of the 5th human revolution. So we have Paleolithic, the Neolithic, the Industrial, I mentioned the agricultural. And the thing about revolutions in human history is people tend not to know they're in it, right? They're just trying to feed their families, keep their occupations or whatever and get by, right? And then it's us, hundreds or thousands of years later, that said, you were in the middle of a revolution long after they're dead. We are in the middle of a revolution right now, and we should all realize that. So the 20th century was the era where engineering, chemistry, and physics made gigantic leaps. And I don't have to list all those, we all know those. It turns out they needed computers less than we did, right? We sent men to the moon with a computer that had the power of 2 Atari game stations, right? So the 21st century is going to be an era of gigantic progress, computationally driven in the biomedical sciences and the social sciences. And I wanted to say that first off because I think that's part of your theme. I'll shut up now.
So I completely agree with that, and we're supposed to fight each other, but
Not necessarily.
We'll get
So,
to that.
and I would say more, I mean, the last month it's quite impressive, the last couple of months. I don't know if you've been playing with ChatGPT, but I think that everyone knows in CSS now it's a game changer. General intelligence is a completely different game than what we were doing just a few months ago. And the fact that I don't know if you've been trying the API in OpenAI, but it took me 10 minutes to set up my system in order to start to do requests, which means that within a couple of months, you can have it in your TV, in your refrigerator, in your computer, and you can already operate that within Python or R to analyze your code, your tables, your results. So it's going to be introduced, and it's considerably different than what we, I think, are going to discuss related to NPL and very specific and targeted kind of strategies to deal with particular types of data. This is a very general purpose kind of technology, I think, and it's very dramatic. So I have 3 kids, and one of them is a computer scientist, one of them is a biologist that is going out to grad school on entomology, and the third one is on German philosophy, English, and literature. Each one of them is going to be affected completely differently by what ChatGPT and general purpose intelligence can do. So I think that we're all discussing to see how we incorporate this in our classes to an extent that we did not do with most of the NLP techniques that we were working for the last 15 years.
Sorry, but when you say that's changed things dramatically, right? So what are the things that you do with it?
So what I'm doing now Okay, so consider
Here
this.
it
I mean,
comes. Just do a nice.
precisely, I mean, I was saying, computer scientists and political scientists, we get together and we work in a project. And we have some NLP process, and the level of efficiency increases 3%, and for computer scientists, that's massive. And for a political scientist, that's trivial. Because, that improvement does absolutely nothing for what we're trying to explain. But if as political scientists I can say, which is what I've been doing, take this data from here, produce from this set of data, from this set of sources, this data set, and incorporate that data set and bring it together, merge it with other data, which is what I'm being able to put in the pipeline, which is I can ask GPT in natural language to do things and produce output that before it would take a couple of hours for people to actually know the techniques. So that means that the bridge between the social sciences and the computer sciences now is going to be vanishes this more. I think that before you have to go to an expert and ask them to code, to run, to get the data. I can actually do it in another language, and GPT is understanding things that I'm asking faster than my grad students. I have to explain more times to my grad students what I want on an algorithm, on a process, on a technique that I want to implement at ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT to update my code and make it more professional and modern using tidyverse and to incorporate an algorithm so I could find a maximum likelihood by brute force that I had. It took 2 minutes. It was well done. It was running. I would have more time. I would take more time to explain to my grad students what I want to do with that code. That for me means that my RAs need to step on the shoulders of ChatGPT to do things that before they were doing. Because the processing time for them to do things, for me, in a month, has declined dramatically.
Can I ask a follow-up question? How do you feel about ChatGPT or similar large language model applications to more domain-specific content questions like legal documents in political science?
So, if we are to do, I know someone wants to jump, but we've seen the scores of the latest iteration being 90%, about 90% of SAT respondents, which of course means it's going to be about 92% of lawyers. I think that a lot of the discussions that we're having substantively in political science today have to do with things like universal salary, and what do we do with a lot of jobs that have been trained for doing things that ChatGPT is already better at. That among the lawyers, the first line of entry, which are processing information, trying to get precedents, trying to organize arguments, a lot of that is going to be very difficult to pay lawyers the fee that we have to do things that ChatGPT is doing. So is the quality great? It's not bad. It's actually better than. But the problem for me is that the errors that you see in ChatGPT are human errors. Are the kind of errors that you actually expect from lawyers that are trying to get this information. So if you want to do something that is an improvement, that is higher quality, that is marginally more efficient or better, you might want to ask, computer scientists, political scientists with 20 years doing this to make an improvement. But is that 3% that within 2 months ChatGPT is going to produce code that being integrated to use that improvement, something that you're willing to pay the cost of all of us? And that's difficult for me. I'm not sure if I understand the question, but.
That's a reasonable segue into the idea of what do these large language models and what do large multimodal models bring to the table and what do they miss? When we were at Berkeley, Austin Van a PhD student in the sociology department, said that this is going to revolutionize how they code data, for us computer scientists, how they label data. But this comes with, the point he made was it comes with a host of biases, right? And it's not possible to necessarily ascertain these, and it's not possible necessarily to reproduce these. Maybe there are other problems that you have as well with this. Maybe it's worth the cost.
My initial reaction, maybe this point has been made many times, but it's the English-centric way that the large language models work, even for other major languages like German, where you have fine-tunings for certain tasks. It is still not at the level of English, which I think is not only a problem of performance, it's also a problem of disguising what is possible.
Mm.
So it's like limiting the possibility of research by creating this English-centric world around it. I think it's one of the major problems.
Second that. I mean, but for the record, I don't think it's just language, right? That whatever data this model has been trained on are definitely severely like Anglo-centric or Eurocentric or global North-centric, right? So the type of views that you're gonna see there or the type of outputs that you're gonna get are gonna be biased culturally and linguistically in general by that. So the problem of overgeneralization, I guess, from whatever you get from the models, I guess in the sense that, you know, treating it as, oh yeah, that will work, is not gonna be, I think, easy to circumvent. You can, okay, so for the record, in my class at some point we had, in this semester, I asked students to actually sit down and annotate data. And I was like, go find the data that you need to perform like a media framing task. And I was like, you can do whatever you want. You can ask ChatGPT to create your data for you, or you can go and try and find news articles and label them yourself. And this is super preliminary, but what we found was that some people tried to use ChatGPT and they got really crappy data that didn't really generalize over the tested, right? So of course it takes some tuning and some iterations to figure out how to use it, and I'm sure we'll be able to use it to an extent, but we'll always have to have some expert, not the computer science expert, the social science expert, you know, give some input, do some, maybe less hard work than before, right?
Not sure.
Yeah, let me add something slightly more positive than that. And I agree, we're not arguing. So the current digital stored universe is about 44 zettabytes, which is 1 times 10 to the 7th power. That's digital information humanity has stored today. And by the way, that's probably wrong, right? It's an estimate, and it'll be different tomorrow and different the day after that. Just to put that in perspective, there's 1 times 10 to the 24 number of stars in the known universe. So, I mean, this is a lot. And the strange thing is the growth, you've all seen these even in the popular media, data store, data process, you know, it looks like that. Right now, today, less than 1% of all stored digital data ever gets analyzed in any way by academics, by business, by governments. So I think we're deep learning, and I'm going to generalize, we're not constantly talking about GPT, and in 2 years it'll be something else, or 1 year it'll be something else. So I think one of the big advantages of the direction we're going as societies, plural, is developing tools that are going to change that 1% into a reasonably higher number, and we have a lot to gain by doing that.
And let me add to this. A lot of the biases that you see are very Eurocentric, US-centric, most-centric. And to a large extent is because if I get, for example, someone in Argentina or Brazil to pay the salary of a CS to work for the government or for some agency, I have a political problem. There is no way that most governments in the South, in global South, can pay the salaries that are competitive so that you can actually process that kind of data to get Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, etc. But what happens once you eliminate the barrier in which the technical gap, the skill gap that is required to analyze the data goes down so dramatically that all the repositories that we have, all the TV shows that we have in Portuguese, in Spanish, and in Korean, you know, all the shows that we have that is non-structured information that we can process start to be processed locally because we get the skills. So I'm traveling in Latin America, and I spend a lot of time teaching natural language processing, machine learning, and statistics, and the gap is huge. It's very, very, very large. And because it's so large, I teach things, and they're not used to produce much. Generally, I teach people, they learn it, they think it's interesting, and then they move to something else because we have a gap skills that we can overcome. The moment that you have systems, and I agree it's not ChatGPT, but systems of general intelligence that can actually close that gap and start to produce data that is not so biased to the north, then, I'm not saying it's not biased, everything I generalize is going to have bias, but I see that some of the bias has to do with who's the people that have the skills to run a kind of analysis that you need to gather the data. So it's not clear that the solution is to create systems that are less biased, but to create systems in which you socialize the capacity to process information to a much larger extent. Then we're going to see what happens.
I'm going to not argue with you.
Oh.
because I just got back from Buenos Aires, and a workshop, and I do one in Montevideo as well. And one of the messages I gave is most of this software is free. And this is really important. Are you going to spend thousands of dollars for SaaS, right? Or are you going to download Python? And so I think that's a real changer in a lot of areas where they don't have US, European level resources to do our problems. I wouldn't worry about Korea one bit though.
Oh, no, I know. I realized as soon as I say Korea, that's like the grasping.
Yeah.
Well, Korean is still low resource.
I'm watching a lot of Korean TV shows.
Really?
I really like them, which is kind of sad to recognize here. But so that came to mind.
But I think that we're close to this hope of ingesting the things that we want, right? Like, if we want to have a representative sample of the world's cultural output, like, if we want to talk about overestimation, then you have this problem not just for like language differences, but cultural differences are often enmeshed with that. And another aspect of this is trying to use these models on a domain that they're maybe not so trained on. You know, if you're trying to do legal reasoning, then that's both very place specific and very nuanced quite often. So what do we do there?
I can put it. I mean, if you think about the trajectory, don't look at ChatGPT or whatever, right? We had BERT, very specific, and then 2 years later there were a few hundred BERTs, one language specific, maybe domain specific, right? They maybe, I don't know if they were as good, probably not as good as the English one, but they existed, right? Sorry?
They're not.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree, don't get me wrong. Okay, right now ChatGPT is what it is, but I'm pretty sure that give it a few months and there's gonna be a few hundreds of those tailored specific tasks. So maybe that's
with Llama, right? And then
yes, I don't know. But yeah, I don't use these things for endangered languages. So that's gonna change. I think that's not gonna be an issue. It's just a matter of time. The access to the data, though, is the thing that is the big obstacle, right? And not just South America, also like the problem in Africa.
Yeah.
There's some cultures or communities that are more oral tradition rather than written tradition, and there's still a gap there that to my knowledge, is not addressed yet by current models, but it's definitely the next frontier. And again, I guess give it a few months.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's an interesting point that you made, that like, you said it's just a matter of time, right? I don't know whether this would have been, though, a dominant attitude even like 2 or 3 years ago, where, you know, the matter of time was maybe further off. I don't know, maybe this is tied to the fact that we as humans are very bad at estimating exponentials and we just linearize it.
So, I'm sorry, you were going to say something. So some asymmetries, I'm not sure you can narrow them. And we put an example. We've been working with pages on a project of projects. And so the US, you have 12,000 legislatures, historical data, and you analyze the data, and there's 1.3 million revisions on the data of legislatures, which means that the data that's being produced is massive, and the number of revisions that we get is massive, and we can analyze when it's vandalized, how it's revised, and one of the things we're doing is to try to see whether minorities, women, populations that have less authority in Congress, to what extent their quality, the quality of the pages is lower. Because the fewer number of revisions and the less the investment on the page, the less the quality of the page that you do. So, I take the same pages and I do it for Argentine legislatures, Brazilian legislatures, Guatemalan legislatures. The quality of the page is much lower. The number of revisions is much lower. The amount of data that you're working is much lower. And the question is that going to become narrow? And I don't see that, because I see that the level of production of the Wikipedia pages in English increases much more rapidly than to what extent it's increasing in the other one. So the gap might not narrow. You are seeing an increase in the Wikipedia pages in Spanish, and that improves the quality. To what extent it's going to match the quality, that's a good question. So, if you're powerful, if you reach the quality of the information that describes you, it's also, rich. It reflects, the kind of resources that you have. And if you have the global north and global south being so different in the resources that you have, then inequalities might not shrink at the same speed. But we can invest in those. I mean, the output that we get now, I think, is much better than what it used to a few years ago.
The other thing is, if you think about the last 3 years, and I don't count the 2 years of the pandemic because they don't count, the requirements really changed, right? Before it used to be that social scientists had to sit down and code documents, right, by hand for maybe a year or two in order to be able to then have something to say, right? Now, I tell my collaborators, just annotate 100 sentences, right? You know, do the work, but it's 100 sentences. It takes a week. Then maybe we do a couple of revisions, and then we have some output with these very few short settings, and then we can take that and apply it at scale. So the types of questions that you can try and answer, or even just the amount of questions that you can try and answer, these have already changed, right? It's not about ChatGPT. You could do this with BERT. So I guess 5 years ago. So yeah, so the requirements changed very, very differently.
It seems to me like there's sort of a dichotomy between what the two of you are saying, where you're pointing out that like you can achieve pretty impressive things with this very small amount of data, and Ernesto, you're saying that the amount of high quality data available to you in the first place is now a function of, for instance, what language you're working on. And there have been people at Hopkins who have written about this like linguistic digital divide. Mark Benzie's group has some really good work on that. But are your two positions in opposition? Are they remediable?
Oh, no, I mean, I completely agree that the digital divide is a thing. It's actually expanding for sure. I'm kind of annoyed that ChatGPT has shifted attention again back to English from all of the work that we're doing cross-lingually and for low resource and underserved languages. But that doesn't mean that the amount of data and the quality of them that you're going to be getting in all the other communities is also going up. And I think I agree with Ernesto that it's going to become definitely a lot easier for that to happen. So, yeah. So, I guess.
If we think that at some point the North is going to converge on a certain type of efficiency rating, for example, natural language, and then the growth is going to be very small, then at some point maybe the global South is going to catch up. I mean, there's only so much that you can increase the efficiency of your model. So at some point you might not. I don't know. I don't think the quality of the pages is going to improve as much, but the quality of the algorithms that we use to interpret that, it might.
What do you mean by quality of pages, actually?
So if you, for example, read the page of Cristina Kirchner, the former president in Argentina, the English version and the Spanish version, the English version is actually better.
Oh, you mean the amount of information in the...
Yeah, so Wikipedia measures this through a set of indicators, like for example, how many references are used, how it's connected to our pages, how many revisions, the quality of those revisions, the number of editors that they have. So we have a number of things that are not connected to how the quality of the page is read, how well we can interpret what the page says, but what is the quality of the page itself. And we have content that has different quality. And in order to have content of different quality, you need to invest resources on the quality of those pages. So we don't need just our instruments to understand what Wikipedia is saying. We can have a page of Wikipedia that's just lower quality, and it's not overcome by the fact that your ChatGPT in Spanish is good. It's still going to be lower quality.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just thinking that at least for the type of setting that you're talking about, we already have translation tools and we have cross-lingual retrieval tools and all of that. You don't need to restrict yourself to just one language, right, or just on one community or something. You can try and leverage a good chunk of human knowledge in multiple languages, and do the same work.
Yeah, there's an economy. I mean,
Yeah.
if you have 3 million people in one country, Uruguay, and they are producing information for that country, the amount of information they're going to produce is a
is lower than what you're gonna
Yeah.
get. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
So,
I was gonna say, do you think there's gonna be some sort of positive feedback loop where, like you're saying, Ernesto, there's a lot of high quality data that can be produced by ChatGPT in English, and so therefore a lot of high quality English content is gonna be produced on the internet via ChatGPT generated content. So then ChatGPT is gonna improve further, this positive feedback loop, and then the languages that it's worse in are not gonna be generating as much content. Like, do you think that'll have an effect in the future, potentially? Does that make sense?
I mean, I have my answers to this. But we're gonna hear from you.
I was gonna say, my answer is I don't know, there's gonna be a feedback loop. Is it gonna be, you get crap out, or hallucinations out, and because it's high quality, it's fluent English, don't get me wrong. Is it what you need? It could be a negative feedback loop. I don't know. Maybe it's gonna be positive, and that's positive. But
Okay.
If you want to talk about negative feedback loops, does anyone know what the second largest Wikipedia is?
I do.
WikiLeaks.
In terms of in number of articles, Tagalog, right?
Close.
Oh,
It's Giovanna. And David Urowski, one of our faculty members here, has been interviewed talking about how actually most of this Giovanna data is machine translation outputs of fairly low quality. So you wind up with exactly the negative feedback loop that you're talking about. You get garbage out, you fit a model to that, you produce more idiosyncratic garbage. It's reasonable to me to suspect that if you have not quite human distribution text that you're producing and now filling the internet with, that you are learning this new distribution, that you are, like, if people are familiar with the idea of knowledge distillation, right? You're fitting to the outputs of your model instead of fitting to naturalistic data.
I replaced,
I was gonna say, but aren't you in a sense also getting some sort of like human feedback? Because if ChatGPT produces garbage, you're not gonna put that in. I mean, some people would, but like you're not gonna put that in like some content generation, like your website or your resume or something. So
Are you sure?
yeah.
that's true. I guess some people would do that.
If
Last week I heard someone that to give feedback to employees being fed up of writing the same thing in different ways, basically ask for machine generated content, just slightly, fine tuned, off you go. So you may receive decent enough of a text that is not perfect, clean it up a little bit and use it. That does not do anything for the overall quality of the text itself. So just because it's not perfect and gets used doesn't improve anything. So it's still garbage to a certain extent that is out there.
Yeah, but I'm imagining I don't know, for example, I would use, as an example, I would use ChatGPT I'd write an entire email, I'd send it through ChatGPT, ask it to improve the quality of it, and then if I don't like it, I won't use it, but if I do like it, I would use it. So I imagine there's this shifting quality, alignment for what's actually existing on the internet, so the
But
amount
it
of...
seems to be starting from the point of view that what you get is decent, and then by simply looking, you may improve it. It's very debatable that this interaction will produce improved text.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Maybe yes, maybe no.
True.
So
I'm not a native English speaker. I won't guarantee that when I get machine-generated text and I fix it, it's going to be better than any other garbage. That's what I'm saying.
So, let me tell you one thing that's going to happen for sure in the election that we have come. Because, I do politics, so I get oftentimes requests from Latin America to analyze massive amounts of data on social media. And generally you can detect bots. They have a fingerprint that you can analyze and you can understand. I know with ChatGPT, I can now create a process by which I can produce very realistic political chats that I can insert in the campaign. I can do it from my machine without spending much time. And I know that there are going to be soon requests coming from politics to intercede and to produce information and just to provide some guidelines to the ChatGPT request that you send through the API so that you can introduce massive amount of information. So we can substitute now humans in a way that's going to be extremely realistic. This is before the image processing capabilities are supposed to come in a few months. This is going to be a political problem. So the amount of information we're going to get is going to get shifted, not just because it's going to get shifted in terms of quality, but because think about politics. We replace every person on the planet with one chat, and then we get some framing for a political event. Now you have different access to resources, you can produce different amounts of those chats GPT, and we've been building for 10 years for, with fake information produced by chats. It was very low quality. You can actually detect that we have this number of jokes about interventions that have been ridiculous in politics. I don't think that will be the case anymore. So there's going to be a lot of quality information issues, not just because of whether the information is good, credible, but also because attitudes that are not to expected to just represent quality information because it describes facts as they come. It reflects people's preferences for certain types of policies. We're going to be in trouble. I actually expect that that's going to start to happen within this election cycle, because I know that I can incorporate it very easily into my production process. Then I know that everyone is working in politics today can do the same. There are going to be some issues on the quality of data we're going to retrieve to analyze again. Am I being too dark on thinking that, or
Unfortunately not.
Yeah.
Well, we'll soon be checking this, right?
So we have to. So if you don't mind us shifting directions a little bit, bringing it back to related discussions of social science meeting computational science, if you're trying to do research that does bridge these two disciplines, what sort of things need to be clarified for someone who is squarely in either your camp or potentially the other camp? If you want to have more effective collaborations, if you have experiences in this area, that will also help.
I think there's a challenge there with traditional social scientists and what's going on computationally. There's a tension. So I tend to hang out with political scientists at my own peril. But in many of these literatures, sociology, political science, you want to go model something with the data set. There's a set of inside the horizon variables, to use Ed Lemer's language, that you basically have to have on the right-hand side of some specification, or the reviewers will come over and beat you up, right? So if you're doing voting and you don't have race, education, income, you know the list. If you're doing conflict, there's a bunch. And so what if you take a scholar like that and you say, I want to work with you with these tools, and we're going to emphasize prediction, and you get a much better prediction using a set of variables that are not in a 30, 40, 50-year-old literature. That's a real dichotomy with classic generalizable statistical modeling in the social sciences. And I think that tension exists and is going to exist for a while in the academic sense. So what if I predict way better than you with your classic set of specifications or right-hand side variables? Does that mean I'm better, right? Well, that person's also going to say, well, I don't think shoe size matters in voting, but I can say, look, I've got this regularization tool that says there's an important variable, and I predict 10% better when I have hair size and hair color and shoe size.
I think that's going to depend on which journal you're trying to publish at, whether they're going to like that or not. So this is a very practical view on things, but I think collaborations, the first question is, what kind of audience do you have in mind? Are you speaking to a computational audience, or are you speaking to a social science?
Well,
it determines the journal, venue, everything.
Well, see, now we do have a disagreement. So I'm editor-in-chief of Political Analysis, which is the top quantitative journal in political science and the social sciences by every metric you can imagine. And so I see all these reviewers with statements on both sides of that spectrum. This is not a random sample of reviewers in the social sciences, right? This is a computational and statistical journal. So there's no question that audience has reviewers and readers, right? But we pick a mainstream journal, comparative politics journal, right? These are the reviewers that are going to be very difficult to convince that, I can predict way better this event. And by the way, I can predict the next election in country X, and you're gonna test me when that election happens, right? And if shoe size and hair color really matter, but I can predict based on that and 20, 30 other variables, that's a different statement than a lot of, I think, comparative politics reviewers would accept.
But to build on that, in one, I think it was the Berkeley Roundtable, a couple of the panelists pointed out that, yeah, publishing at the cross of the field is fantastic, but if my PhD is in sociology, if I don't publish in the key journals of sociology, my PhD advisor, my peer,
Tenure committee.
exactly, will not really care about the fact that I'm publishing 3 or 4 ACL venues, that I do all these great things. So what you're saying, yes, of course, matters, that there are different ways of finding the same results or better results. At the end of the day, the venues for publishing remain very much entrenched in their own system. And there are, unfortunately, very few at the cross of the two disciplines venues for publishing. And that makes it even more complicated.
That's a really important point, because when we as social scientists get the most conservative about anything, it's tenure and promotion time, right? So you can say, I value proceedings, and I value working with computer scientists, and I value prediction, right? And then you sit in a room and you're evaluating your junior candidate, you're absolutely right about that. And that really shouldn't be the criteria, right? It's a narrow traditional criteria, but we do that to ourselves.
But let me put the other side of this. So the last searches that we have in the department were cluster searches with the high school, and we are now in agreement with CS, with computer science at Maryland, with the information school, and with the computational linguistics department. Most of the people that are publishing that we were looking at, they were publishing in all of these different journals. They were targeting these different journals. And those were the people that were the most competitive. My 2 best placements in the last few years, both of them had internships in Twitter, in Facebook, and something that we didn't used to have here, political scientists that are doing internships in industry and then coming back to major universities is happening regularly now. The people that we consider the top of the field today are the people that are publishing in general journals, Nature, PNAS, and that didn't used to be the case. And more departments are looking at the impact factor, precisely because a lot of money is coming from information science and from computer science, and we want to tap into that money. So it's not just the science. So we look for clusters because we can tap into that, but then you have to expand what are the criteria to promote, and the field is changing dramatically. When I see the placement in all the US this year, political science, the number of requests that you have for political communication, for CSS, is dramatic. Way more than for the classic political institutions, comparative political institutions, comparative political behavior, American behavior, and in all the departments are integrated into it. So I think that the result of what we're talking about is that most of the departments in the US are creating CSS labs of different types and start to recruit for those. So we'll see what happens with journals. So when I started to study stats, his book on Bayesian stats and Gamma book on Bayesian stats were the 2 first that I bought.
And mine was better, right?
Miles ahead. But the interesting thing is that now we generally use computer science articles, linguistics articles, computational linguistics articles. We're not bound by that.
And that's a really important point, because computer scientists publish differently than we do.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
And better.
That's been the biggest hurdle in working
Absolutely,
across
absolutely. And so, one question is how are committees going to treat those proceedings in the social sciences? And I hope it's your story.
I think it's going to go in the direction of money.
It's hard to argue with that.
So I've seen now a couple points on how money is driving a little bit the research, not only in computer science, but now outside of computer science. What are the possible problems of not only computer scientists, but also social scientists now following where the money is going in academia, rather than like...
I have an anecdotal response to that. So I mentioned that I have a project with our chair of computer science on detecting latent anti-Semitism, designing some machine learning and related tools. When we thought about where to go for funding, outside funding, we basically hit a wall. So forget NIH, forget NEA, what about NSF? Well, one of the things we're doing is we're taking people who communicate anti-Semitic language in coded phrases, want to do that so that their adherents get it and other people don't, right? So there's a set of code phrases and they change over time, and that's what our algorithm is trying to detect and work on. One of them is called cultural Marxism. And until 4 months ago, that would have gone right over my head. I would have no idea that was code for Jew, okay? It turns out Ted Cruz's forthcoming book has that in the title. And we've known that for a while. It's already on Amazon. So, and you know how sensitive political science at NSF is, right, to Congress. So can we say we're trying to, you know, identify this language? And oh, by the way, a sitting US senator is about to use it in the title of his book. So sometimes these things clash between the awkward things that social scientists like to study, particularly sociologists, right? You know, spousal abuse, illegal drug use, and so on and so forth, with funding sources in a way that I think almost all computer scientists don't deal with in their like non-social science research.
Yeah, I would live with it. Well, yeah, I don't have a lot of input on funding because coming from the computer science perspective, at least my perspective is that you guys have all of the interesting problems because right now, and I think more computer science are going to switch and turn back to you hopefully to find interesting questions to answer because on there's definitely interesting side within computer science, but at some point it's all going to be just neural nets and kind of boring. That's my perception. But
there's a cultural thing going on that's really interesting. So I co-founded the machine learning group at WashU, and I can't tell you the number of talks and job talks I went to where somebody was cleaning up a dirty picture of the Mona Lisa, you know, a fuzzy picture, and doing it 5 seconds faster than this competing algorithm. And so in the computer science world, in the educational process, it seems to me nobody, like there isn't a class that says, here's a bunch of really important social problems that you can go apply your tools to. And so I think this cooperation between computer scientists and social science is really driven by these sort of sympathetic or symbiotic backgrounds in the way that you just described.
Yeah, but to be fair, up until very recently, our tools didn't really work. You know,
well, then we didn't need you. No, but I mean, for the last 10 or 15 years at least, there's been a enhanced cooperation between the two groups that I've seen at least.
Molly, you're a postdoc right now with, you know, here at the Center for Digital Humanities. This is probably your bread and butter.
Yeah, I mean, the funding source thing is, I think, even more complicated for humanities because social sciences, at least, they have a history of quantitative methods, which is not the case in humanities, at least not one that is acknowledged by humanists, which really changes the venue discussion, journal discussion, where do you apply for funding discussion. All you have are the sort of born interdisciplinary venues that will accept such things, but not necessarily what are considered the top 3 peer-reviewed journals. So I'm not sure. I'm hoping for better change, obviously, but I don't know. I don't have like full faith in that yet.
But do you at least think you have the more interesting problems?
I think so. I think the problem is though the humanists I feel are more reluctant to go to computer scientists for answers because they're not sure. For example, take predictions. Predicting is a valuable thing in the social sciences. You want to be able to give good predictions. But when I say, oh, we can predict anything, plug anything humanistic, and they're like, we don't need you to predict anything. So it's not considered a task that is valuable in itself. So it's constantly, for me, has been a practice of translation. Prediction means that there's a reliable way of connecting two things that you might have otherwise thought distinct, like shoe size and elections. So I think there's more of this translation work that needs to be done in humanities.
So we have the Maryland Institute of Technology in the Humanities,
Yeah.
and we also have the high school. And one is a bridge to the social sciences and the other one to the humanities. The one to the social sciences thrive and the one to the humanities is not getting almost any funding. And because we haven't been able to have a kind of dialogue. So there's a joke that maybe you heard it, a library halfway between Harvard and MIT, and there's a stand outside says every book $5. So this guy arrives and, I'm sorry about the gendered comment, but arrives, gets a few books, and goes in and says, how much is it? And he says, are you from Harvard and do not know how to count, or from MIT and do not know how to read? So, and I always felt that in social sciences happened that, we had ideas of how society worked, and we couldn't transform that into models, and people in computer sciences know how to work with the models, but had no idea how to think about the problem. And we thought that what you needed was to bring both together and have a dialogue, but you also need people in the middle that can run the data and can understand the problem, because you need bridges. I think in the social sciences, it started with people like Jeff. They started to make inroads, and now we have a significant crowd of people that can do both. They can run the stuff and they can think about the stuff. And in the humanities, we have not had that transition. So my wife directs Latin American Study Centers, and she's an appointed of both social science and humanities. She's halfway between RHU and BISUS. And she can see everything in the investment side, and the amount of money that you get on the staff, the amount of money you get to investing in journals, the amount of money that you get in the infrastructure of social science is way larger than the humanities. And therefore, humanities becomes a service department. And if we cannot move it away and have a dialogue in which you train the people to work on both, it becomes very difficult.
But going back to the interesting questions, I want to say that
That wasn't the interesting
Oh,
question.
that humanities have the interesting research questions. That I think people tend to disregard the fact that humanities and literature as a discipline started out by asking very computational questions without computers, like the problem of semantic shifts, which we would have today possibly used diachronic word embeddings to study. That was like linguistics was extremely tied to the study of literature in the beginning of the 20th century when it was being established as a discipline of comparative literature. So I think reminding ourselves that this was once the case might be the way forward.
For humanities.
For humanities.
I mean, related to this, and one of the hurdles in communicating across the departments has been the big focus that we have on quantitative stuff in CS and the qualitative aspect of research in social science, at least the way I understand it, where it's all about, interviewing people and then just digesting what people say and then, having a new thought, right, based on the abstract things that were discussed. But I cannot measure that, right? So there's always been this tension between, there's some labels that I can predict, and I can be, sure, yeah, there's 90% accuracy on all of these, and I'm happy. But anything that goes beyond that on the qualitative side has always been like very hard, hard to model, hard to count. So that's been an issue, and that's where I think potential these types of tools like ChatGPT kind of go back to this. You can use them as in my opinion, like the side tool to process all of that and scale up the qualitative side of things.
Not to put an end to what I think is going to be a lively bit of the discussion, but we are in what's roughly the final minutes, so we do try to end these roundtables with what's called a CD of failures. So the idea was first originated by a faculty member at the University of Edinburgh, popularized by a faculty member in Germany, who put out, here are the fellowships I didn't get, here are positions that I didn't get, papers that were rejected, and of course the meta-level failure of this CV of failures has gotten more recognition than any of my academic output at all. And it's useful, I think, to get a sense of, given that you've all worked in this area for varying amounts of time, what sort of failures you've had along the way and what they've taught you. We have the faculty member here, Mark Dredsey, who in his wall, on the wall in his office, keeps his rejection letter from being trying to become a PhD student here at Hopkins and a faculty member. But I'm sure that each of you has had that same sort of experience along the way.
Grudges?
Yeah, well, that's taught you.
So I have one he's gonna like a lot.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so, when I first saw your question, I was thinking, well, I don't have any failures. You know,
Must be nice.
no, that's not true. The failure I was thinking of is don't compete with computer scientists, because there's more of them and they push the work out faster and they're very smart. Work with them rather than compete with them. And as late as maybe 10 or 12 years ago, there was the director of the American Statistical Association had an editorial in the AMSTAT thing. And it was basically like kind of an us versus them thing. You can look this up. You know, like, oh, we need to work harder as statisticians and look at this invasion by computer scientists. And so I think that was a mistaken perspective, and I've definitely changed my attitude in the last decade or so. He still doesn't like it.
It's good. I was just thinking of my failures, that's all. I don't know what failures. I did get rejected from all the PhD programs that I applied to in the US, and then I was just lucky that the guy that I actually really wanted to work with found my application in the reject pile, and he happened to have some extra money and moving universities, and I only applied to schools in California because I'm from Greece and I wanted to be somewhere sunny. And he's like, hey, I'm going to Notre Dame. Do you want to go there? I was like, are you in Paris? But turns out I ended up spending 5 years in the middle of nowhere, Indiana, and absolutely loved it. So it wasn't really a failure, I guess. Another kind of like more recent failure in the collaboration that I had with a policy expert in our project was, and I did get a chance to talk about it, this idea of confirmation bias, where we were analyzing some data and we started with simple, good old LDA, right, which I'm sure a lot of people here know, and we showed the outputs to our colleague in the policy school. He was like, this is really cool, right? That it picks up on this and picks up on the other thing and picks up on this third thing. So let's push this forward. And we're like, okay, let's try with better models. And we tried some neural models, and again, we went back and it was like, oh, hey, this is really cool. It picks up on some other things and everything. Long story short, you can find anything you need on the outputs of those models. And later when we looked at it, we realized that actually our models hadn't even been trained. So the stuff that we're showing. There was a bug somewhere on the stuff that we were showing, and we were like, oh shoot, we should really be careful on what we show them and do always contrastive things and things like that. So that was a bit of a failure that set us back a couple of months, but we fixed the models, so we don't have results yet. Yes.
My failures are not notable. I'm thinking I haven't been doing enough work in the field. I feel like to have cool failures to learn from. So I'll just, I think, pass for now.
So I felt that the CV of failures that was being circulated was a disgrace, because there's no way that those are the failures. You know, I have 50-something articles. I have at least 3 rejections on average for the articles I published, which means that my CV has to have at least 150 rejections. And if I consider PhD programs, as you were saying, the number of rejected PhD programs is way larger than the number of acceptances. The number of grants that I won is just a fraction of the number of grants that I lost, which means that my CV of failures is 100 pages. It's not that I was rejected from this program I really like, I was rejected from this program, I didn't publish this article. It's just a massive number of things that, and so you're always modeling, and you're always falling and things, and I get rejections today after 20-something years in the business, and I still don't feel great. It used to bother me a lot, because of course you put a lot of work, but now I get rejections still. I mean, this year I have a student that is amazing, Tiago Ventura. He went to CSMAP and now he's going to be a faculty at Johns Hopkins and Georgetown. So he did something that's wonderful. He's not as lazy as I am. So every article that he has, he's been tracking where he sends it a rejection and when he's R&R and then he's rejected. And so, he has a dozen articles and I'm like in half of those as well. So you can see that, of the 10 articles that have been accepted, there's a trace of 30 things that went wrong, and that's once the article was good enough to be submitted. So when people put the CV of failure, it's kind of odd because we're failing all the time. I mean, and you keep failing all the time. So I don't understand. I understand the signal wants to be sent, but the signal tends to be way nicer than what it actually is.
But there's a good version of that, which is true, which is academics tend to fail in private and succeed in public. So you don't have to tell anyone about the grants you didn't get or the articles you rejected, but they read about the ones you succeed on. That's a great deal, right?
Which is like social media. The best version of myself is there, and when I see him, I'm jealous. It has nothing to do with what is actually in my real life. I think it's exactly the same thing.
I mean, it wouldn't be fair for us to ask you to flaunt your failures without sharing some of ours as well. So there was a paper that we had worked on that was one of the early stages of this Hong Kong work. It was eventually published at not ACL, but we submitted it to ACL at one point. And our two reviewers, one of them said to us, yes, okay, well, this is very interesting, but could you maybe talk less about some of the context, the Hong Kong history, put that in the appendix and go more into detail of the math of what you did. And then reviewer 2 said, yes, okay, we know this math, it's very interesting what you've put here, it's novel, it's fun, whatever. Maybe though, to give more room for the context, put that in the appendix. So we have these conflicting instructions which taught us a bit about these differing expectations that specifically ACL has, and a lot of this comes from the fact that we are much afield about methods and not necessarily about the theory and the content. So this was difficult for us in the early stages.
And to add to that, in a paper that wasn't using computational techniques but very elaborate vintage statistics, once the comment was the paper is rejected because it makes no intellectual contribution whatsoever. So I think that if you want sort of like a crown of major failure, it's like, okay, fine. But I think that the response was like, yeah, bothers me, but at least it's a major failure. It's really good. So.
One of those articles I sent, they say this person is either too new to the field or has no idea of what he's talking about. That was, which I actually think, now seeing in perspective, that speaks also poorly of the reviewer, even if he was right or she was right. But that said, I received brutal reviews, and my worst one, I was a grad student. And with my advisor, we sent an article that got an R&R at APSR, which is a top journal in the field of political science. And he was kind of, my advisor was not happy about the review. And you defer to your advisor a lot of those things. So the review that he did, I think it was not what I would do today. But it doesn't matter. The fact is that it got rejected. So I could have been in the market with an APSR. I ended up going to the market with that article, and that article came 2 years later in Gill, which is a very small journal. And so I got two R&R, double R&R rejections, so through rounds of review and rejection from HAPS, JOP, and APSR. So, and those are painful. So I hit the big three.
Yeah, exactly. That's just like awesome.
So yeah, it's.
But never underestimate the stupidity of reviewers. I once got rejected for not understanding the Gill book. I was on my office door for a year. That's what one of my snarky colleagues said.
So, on that note, I do want to take some time to thank the four of you, and I also want to thank two other people who have been instrumental in this Roundtable series and the Cassandra Project as a whole. One of them is Sanjeev Kudnapur, who has been, tirelessly our champion in helping to make these events happen.
I have.
And he's humble too.
And also the entire grant.
Yeah, we have this lovely administrative quirk that a Whiting faculty member must be on the grant for it to be housed in Whiting, and Sanjeev happily took up that mantle and has been helping us every step of the way. And the other is Tom Lippincott, who has provided boundless advice and boundless positivity as we've gone through this. So thank you. And thank you to the four of you for sharing your thoughts with us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.